I am especially excited about today's episode because my guest is Sendhil Mullainathan, one of my absolute favorite people in the world. Sendhil is a world-class economist, a MacArthur Genius recipient, and holds a university professorship at the University of Chicago. That's a special position reserved for only the most highly esteemed faculty. Only 10 of the university's 3,000 faculty members have that title. What makes Sendhil so special? His mix of brilliance and childlike curiosity make him unlike anyone I've ever known. His research reflects his curiosity. He's written about everything from racial bias and artificial intelligence algorithms to the psychological effects of poverty, from the determinants of CEO pay to corruption and who gets a driver's license in India.
Welcome to People I Mostly Admire with Steve Levitt.
I've known Sendhil for 25 years, but it wasn't until he left Harvard to come to the University of Chicago a few years back that I came to fully appreciate him. Lots of people are interesting if you only talk to them once a year, but not many people can make everyday conversation fascinating. He just never fails to amaze me with his creativity and breadth of knowledge, and I'm quite confident that once you hear him talk, you'll agree. Sendhil, I always eagerly look forward to our conversations, and two reasons I love talking to you are, first, there's always something that has you so excited you can barely contain yourself, and second, what that something will be is completely unpredictable. So the last time we talked, it was an Oculus virtual reality headset that had transformed your life. So is your love for the Oculus still going strong?
Absolutely. I have to say, it is one of the more amazing inventions. I'm sure that lots of people out there who've been using it for years are like, how is this an insight? But these media for communication by which we can translate ideas to each other, they may start off as novelties, but they have profound consequences on how we live our lives.
So I was convinced when we talked and you were so excited, I went right home and I immediately bought an Oculus for my research center because one of our goals is to transform the educational system. And the way you described your experiences, all I could think about is that the possibilities if we got this technology into classrooms must be infinite. And I must say, the workers in my center, I've never seen them tackle a project with such gusto. Our Oculus has been in use, I'd say, 10 to 12 hours per day, every day. And all of that time, I'm sure, is devoted to exploring the educational potential of the device. One thing I know about you is you don't think small, you always think big. What's your big vision for what happens with VR?
Let me throw out an idea for you and see what you think. Why do we go into offices at all? I mean, at all. Why do we fly across country? Why do we do any of it? And it's because there is still a reality that somehow when you and I talk on the phone, or when you and I even talk on Zoom, it's not quite the same as being in person. Now, it's entirely possible that we can recreate that experience 100% with virtual reality, which, if you think of the knock-on consequences, let me give you an example. One of the things that people say is that the cell phone decoupled a phone number from a location. Suddenly, the cell phone made it so that a phone number referred to you, not the address at which it was sitting. Now, that has profound consequences. If similarly, your office location was not a physical place, but was you can work from anywhere, you can do anything. It totally transforms our capacity to interact with each other and how we interact. So I'm curious what you think of that one.
I actually thought you were going to say something different. I thought you were going to emphasize the fact that with virtual reality, you can bring any place to you.
Oh, I love that.
As well as you bring you to any other place. So you can be in the Grand Canyon or under the water or inside a molecule. You can be miniature now moving around NaCl, sodium and chlorine atoms.
Yeah, that's a great idea, including places that aren't really places per se. You could be inside of an atom, as you said. You could be inside of the brain watching neurons fire. You've seen this, right? Like a good figure, a good drawing of some effect suddenly changes your understanding of it. So people say Maxwell, for example, came up with his equations for electricity in large part because he came up with these good diagrams. And the same is true of Feynman diagrams, etc. Imagine what it's going to do for science if you can put yourself in high fidelity simulations of the thing that you're studying. Bring the place to you is a terrific way of putting it.
What's the path? The one problem is you've got this two-sided market issue, which is that, let's just say schools are the target. If schools don't have the technology and adopt it, then it doesn't make sense to develop the programs for it. But the schools won't adopt until you have the programs.
If you look at a lot of the early day uses of computing, they weren't blow you away. They're just things that really got some people excited. Like I remember calling up bulletin boards to do virtual Dungeons and Dragons with, like, there was a modem. I still remember going, now you would have said, we built all this technology so you can play a role-playing game? Well, whatever. But it's related to your research assistants who work at your center. They're playing, and play is so underrated because it just fuels this first phase of all sorts of infrastructure building. And so I think even if 10 years out, we imagine all these grand changes, it heartens me that right now people who start playing with it enjoy playing and then start tinkering and make stuff they enjoy, because that gives you that kind of base layer of stuff and just creates demand. And from it, you get all this other cool stuff.
And never having done it myself, what makes it so special?
Here's a psychological fact that I think many people may not realize. It's like when someone says to you optical illusion, you think, oh, I know that. It's like this image where it's an old lady or a young woman. You can look at it both ways. But they forget that like every photograph, every TV screen is an optical illusion because it is truly two-dimensional, but your mind creates 3 dimensions. There's no 3 dimensions. It's just 2. But that optical illusion is actually relatively low fidelity. You put on the VR set and it feels 100% like 3D. So for example, there's this little thing with Jurassic Park and a dinosaur. And I was like, oh, let me play this video. Your heart is beating. And when the thing's tail comes at you, you say to yourself, it's not a real tail. Do not duck. And then you're like, I'm ducking before I know it. It taps into this very basic sensory system. And that's just amazing.
This is going to seem off point, but about 20 years ago in a seminar, you said something, Sendel, and I remember virtually nothing from 20 years ago. It's incredible that I remember this. You were giving a seminar. We were both just young professors getting started. And you said something like, a stranger tells you some random fact. You're far more likely to remember that fact if the stranger is wearing a bright orange clown wig than if she's average looking, even though it's the same fact. And your point was about salience and how things that are unrelated to the actual content have a huge impact on how people perceive it. Now, I find it so ironic that I can remember this point you made about salience. Somehow you turned into the clown. Do you remember saying that?
I don't remember the clown specifically, but it is something that stuck with me. The mind doesn't code information because it's important or you really want to remember it. It codes information because of these kind of salient things. And it reminds me of, I'm not going to ask if you read it, but have you at least pretended to read Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past?
No, I've never even pretended to read it.
Some of us have pretended to read it. It's 6 volumes or something. So at a minimum, you can say things like, I read volume 1, even though you basically bought it. So the opening scene in there is exactly this. He's in bed and he bites into this Madeleine, this pastry, and suddenly he's flooded with this memory of being at his aunt's house. And he realizes it's because the flavor of this pastry is strongly associated with that time at his aunt's house. And there's something as simple as the smell and flavor brings with it these evocative, beautiful memories. And you'll notice this in yourself, like smell, so salient, brings with it so many things. The memory system doesn't work the way you want it to work.
And so is it your hypothesis that lessons taught through virtual reality might be much stickier than other means of learning?
Absolutely, yeah. I'd say that in general, we learn so much better when we're doing things than when we're just listening to things. I'll give an example. If I say to you, think of one of your favorite meals from a past vacation 5 years ago, you can probably remember, like you had it exactly once, but you can probably remember the dish and you can probably remember what was in it and you remember the feeling you had. That's astonishing. If I said to you, remember a good conversation, I feel like, I don't know, we talked. It was nice. It was fun. But taste, smell, these things, they're just hardwired back in.
So along those lines, I told you something I remembered from 20 years ago, but I also want to make a confession to you. You wrote a book, and I don't know, it must have been almost a decade ago, and the book was called Scarcity. And I love the book. I read it in 2 or 3 sittings. My blurb is on the cover of the book, and I've raved about it to anyone who would listen. So as preparation for this conversation today, I went back and I looked at the book for the first time in ages. Obviously, I remember the key thesis of the book. Like you have a really simple point that has stuck with me. But I would have sworn I have never read the book before. It's loaded with these stunning experimental results and these interesting stories. And as I read them, I felt like I had literally never read about this experiment before, when obviously I had. And I would have thought, sure, I couldn't reproduce. If someone said, what's on page 7 of Sendel's book, I wouldn't be able to do it. But I would have thought that, oh, yeah, of course, this is the study when the people weren't allowed to have lunch and then they had to do the word search. Oh, yeah, I came back. Nothing. The good news is I enjoyed it just as much the second time because it was all new to me. But the bad news was it really scared me because I would have expected that seeing the stories, I would remember them. I wonder if my chronic lack of sleep from having too many kids has really left me somehow deeply mentally impaired. What do you think?
So that's at the heart of this app that we're releasing that I want to tell you about in a second. But I also want to tell you that your experience is the experience everybody has. Lately, I've asked people the following question. Hey, what's a novel that you really like? And they'll tell me the novel. And I'm like, great. Can you tell me how it ends? And they're like, oh. I said, okay, fine. You can't do that. Can you tell me 2 of the main characters' names? They're like, I remember one kind of. And it's amazing how quickly things that you've read, they come in and they go out the other ear. It's just astonishing.
Do you think that's particular to reading? Is reading an especially bad way to gather information? Or you think it's more generic?
I think it's 2 things. We imagine the mind to be this sort of warehouse of information, but don't appreciate how much is just open doors. It's like a train station that people walk through. Like ideas are just going through the train station of our mind. Not many things stay behind. But you're onto something. I think reading is just such a bad way to learn because in many ways it's passive. It's not experiential. Like you remember your experiences. You remember the feeling of being on a roller coaster. Those physical highs, those ahas that you yourself have experienced, but not the things that you've read about. One of the things, therefore, I try to do in class is rather than teach people things, I try to create little experiences for them. You'll like this one, Steve. So do you know this $20 auction? You basically say, I'm going to auction off this $20 bill.
The both pay version, where both people have to pay.
Both people have to pay.
I love that. Yeah. Tell people about it. It's incredible.
Yeah. In class, I hold it up and say, here's a $20 bill. I'm going to auction it off. And I'm going to give it to the winner just to make things interesting. The highest bidder wins the bill and pays. The second highest bidder doesn't get anything, but they also pay. So at first, everyone's a little hesitant. You're like, okay, $20 and minimum increments of bids of $1. So of course, somebody says $1. And you say, okay, $1. Going once, going twice. I'm not going to let this guy get $20 for $1. So someone else bids $2. And that's all you need.
So the key is that unlike every other auction in the world, both the high bidder and the second place bidder both have to pay. They pay whatever their bid was.
Exactly. And the highest bidder wins the bill.
Yep.
Okay. So once you have one person bid $1 and somebody else has bid $2, think of what is about to happen. I say, okay, going once, going twice. The $1 bidder is like, well, I'm not going to get it for $2 to get to $3. And they just keep leapfrogging each other. A crucial thing happens when someone has bid 10 and 9. The $9 bidder says, I'll bid 11. At that point, I'm making a profit. I've now just auctioned off a $20 bill. At a minimum, I make $1 profit because someone's bid 11, someone's bid 10, I'm getting 21, I'm giving up $20. It seems absurd that I'm making a profit off of this. And the second crucial thing that happens when the highest bid is at 19, because at that point, both players know this is not going to end well, but they don't want to be the one for whom it ends badly. So the $18 bidder's, well, I'm going to lose 18 anyway. Let me bid 20.
I've seen this happen. It's always the same. Until that point, they don't feel that bad because they feel like this is going to end at 20.
Yeah.
Just because I think people so often they bring rules of thumb with them to problems without thinking. So I think, okay, fine. I'll bid 20. I'll break even. The other guy will bid 19. He'll lose 19. We'll be done. But then when you get to that point, something awful sets in. Because what happens then?
The $19 bidder is like, I'm losing 19 and I'm not getting anything. If I just bid $21 for this $20 bill, I can at least recoup some of my losses. Once you cross that boundary, there is no stopping this freight train. It's especially awesome to do in classes when you have these sort of more bro-ish, because they just won't let go. You have to just pull the plug. You have to say, I am calling it here at $42 highest bid. It's absurd. Obviously, the two people involved feel the lesson, but so does everybody else, having been part of it. And I'd say Now let's talk about the sunk cost fallacy, the idea of throwing good money after bad. Now, when you talk about the sunk cost fallacy, it has real personal resonance. Like people will remember this experience, and that lets them understand sunk cost fallacy more than if I just talked it through, don't throw good money after bad, etc.
I never thought about that in terms of sunk costs. What's always been to me so interesting is it's a game that once you start it doesn't have an obvious equilibrium, because if I've bid 40 and you've bid 41, each time I'm faced with roughly the same problem, which is for $2 more,
Yep.
I get a chance at winning 20. And so if the other guy will quit with a 10% probability, it makes sense to do it.
Yeah, exactly. I should walk through how I do it. I say, here's the sunk cost fallacy, throwing good money after bad. Here's something called escalation of commitment, where you consistently keep ignoring. You're like, we've already done it. It's only a little bit more. And I think a lot of sunk cost fallacies play out like this $20 bill auction. They're like these little escalation of commitments, if that makes sense. It's like you're in a bad relationship. Let's give it another week. Okay. But a week from now, where are you going to be that's that different than today? This project doesn't look that good. Let's give it another $10,000 investment and let's see how much. So there's this element of the thing where you've spent some resources, put yourself actually, ironically, not that differently from where you started. And you don't step back and say, where does this whole thing end? Locally, every single extra dollar seems to make sense. But if you step back, you're like, where does this thing end up?
Yeah, the fact that every time you've spent the extra $2, the other guy has topped you, over time that should change your probability about what's going to happen next. And related to that decision making, I woke up in the morning for maybe 5 straight years, and the first thing I thought about every morning is, should I quit my job as a professor? And every morning I thought, God, I would so like to quit, but I can always quit tomorrow, and maybe something will happen today that will make me change my mind. And so I literally delayed my decision because I had this third option, which is, well, as long as I can wait till tomorrow, the cost of waiting is really small. Like a good example in this game is if you weren't given the chance to go up by $2, which is essentially like pushing the decision till tomorrow, if you just had to make a decision, look, I'm either going to play this game until I'm dead or I'm going to stop now, everybody would stop now. It's the fact that you introduce this third option, which is like a wasting away option, that completely defines my life. I would say my entire life, that has been my rule of decision making.
Your point about deferring to tomorrow is so profound because I think there's a deep psychological bias that you tend to think tomorrow will somehow be different. It shows up in so many aspects of life where if you just say to yourself, if tomorrow is a repeat of yesterday, how would I behave differently? And so many things change. There's an employee, they're not that good, they haven't done very well, and you're like, well, let's give them a chance. The first time giving them a chance may make sense, but after 4 times, you're like, if tomorrow is going to be a repeat of yesterday, what am I doing? And that simple heuristic, tomorrow is a repeat of yesterday, really cuts through a lot of clutter, like so much decision clutter.
Do you use that in your own life?
I try to use that in my own life. The place where I've gotten better and better at it is in trying to decide what I should do. What should I work on? And it's tempting to work on things that give you some pleasure in the future, but they're painful right now. And you end up with so many of those things. You say, wait a minute, will tomorrow be like today and yesterday, which is just a lot of grinding out in the hope of some big payoff in the future? That doesn't make any sense. It's like I'm lifting weights for some weightlifting competition that doesn't seem to ever appear. I loved your coin experiment.
The coin experiment that Sendel refers to is a research project I did to learn about whether or not people make good choices. I built a web page for people who were struggling with a hard decision. So should they quit their job or not? Maybe should they end a relationship or stick with it? And I invited those people to be part of an experiment. And if they agreed, I did something really simple. I flipped a coin. And if the coin toss came up heads, I encouraged them to make a change, to end that relationship, to quit the job. And if it came up tails, I encouraged them to stay the course. And the amazing thing is, almost 20,000 people flipped coins, and the outcome of the coin toss actually affected the way people behaved. And 6 months later, I surveyed those people to figure out how happy they were with their choices.
I've taken away the fact that when you're near indifference, which is a lot of the people in your coin experiment. They're like, hey, I'm indifferent. I'll let you decide. And when you're near indifferent, you're not actually near indifferent. So,
exactly.
Right? You should be able to figure out which way the bias goes. You're like, I'm indifferent. Guess what? You have status quo bias. So if you're near indifferent, it's easy. Change. And there's so many things like that. You're like, if you're near indifferent, what's your bias? You tend to pick the better known option. Great. You're near indifferent. Pick the less known option. I found that just a very powerful situation, a powerful tool.
Yeah. For me, it's just a great heuristic because every problem ends up turning into the same problem. As long as I have strong preferences, I follow my preferences. When I don't know what to do, I know that I'm just messed up because history tells me that I'm always stuck with the status quo. And so I should always make the change. Now, even knowing that, I don't make enough changes. It's interesting that I'm the author of a study that says when you're indifferent, you should make a change. And my whole body convulses at the thought of change. And I don't do it. Like incredible. I completely and utterly know that I'm doing something crazy. And I do it anyway. So that's how powerful my status quo bias is.
Oh my God, status quo bias is so powerful. I don't know if you're into food, but one thing I've noticed with food is if you say to somebody, try this, and they're like, oh, it has mushrooms. I don't like mushrooms. Go ahead, just give it a taste. No, I couldn't. I don't like What, are you allergic or poisonous to what? No. And I am completely like this. So much so that my ex-wife, I didn't like soy sauce. I was like, I don't like soy sauce. I don't like that at all. So she would secretly cook me things with soy sauce that I actually liked. It's this thing of like, why am I so wedded to this status quo that I don't even experiment a tiny bit? What does one mouthful cost me? Nothing.
Right.
And it is got to be a given that I don't dislike everything with mushrooms. That is absurd, right? I'm sure I dislike some mushrooms, but not all. And so in food, I really see it because the cost of experimentation is zero. And yet we do so little of it. I often say to people, they'll say, let's go to this restaurant. I have a favorite dish here. Okay, great. Have you tried any of the other dishes? No. How many times have you been here? Like 30 times. Each time, though, I have my favorite. I don't want to give up on my favorite. It's like, you tried one thing. Try a few others.
I have a rule of thumb at restaurants, which is I try one thing. If I like it, I'll go back there over and over. And if I don't like it, I will never go back. I almost never sample two things on a menu.
Go back a second time. Do you try something else or you just try
never.
it?
No, I wouldn't even think about it. Almost every restaurant I frequent, I hit the jackpot the first time, and I can't imagine how anything could be better than the thing that I got the first time ever. But I'm happy about that. Actually, that one doesn't bother me. I do a lot of things that bother me, but that one seems to me, that's sensible. Once you hit something good, why would you ever mess with success?
Next time you go to your favorite restaurant, order the thing you like. And since I know you have the cash, order something else on top. It's like costless experimentation. Just see what it tastes like. Who knows? If they did one thing, maybe they do a second thing, right?
You're listening to People I Mostly Admire with Steve Levitt and his conversation with economist Sendhil Mullainathan. After this break, they'll return to talk about Sendhil's new app that helps people learn new ideas. If you're enjoying this episode, you'll definitely want to check out No Stupid Questions, another podcast from the 1frekonimic Radio Network. Each week, Stephen Dubner and Angela Duckworth ponder the same kinds of perplexing questions about human behavior that Sendhil wrestles with, like why it's so hard to remember what we've read.
Stephen, I've been thinking about a conversation that we had about A Tree Grows in Brooklyn.
You said you loved that book, but you couldn't remember a single thing about it.
It's a really interesting thing that people can read books that they absolutely love. And then when you ask that person, well, what's it about? There's this long pause because, like me, they have no idea at all. They just have this residue of emotion that says, I loved the experience of this book. But I do think it's an interesting question whether we may forget what is in a book, but we don't forget how it made us feel. What do you think?
That's No Stupid Questions. Find and follow it wherever you're listening now.
So if there's one thing we value at People I Mostly Admire, it is the power of ideas and experimentation for making things better. And honestly, most of the good ideas we have on this show come from my producer, Morgan. And so I want to introduce her to everyone. Morgan, can you please say hello?
Hi, Steve. How's it going?
It is going great, except that we put this new segment into the show, which has me answering listeners' questions. And you don't think I'm very good at it. And so my view is, look, if you don't think I'm doing a good job, why don't you come on here with me and help me do a better job? And so we're going to give that a shot today.
I didn't say you were doing a bad job, but I do think that you answer questions that are easy for you to answer.
Oh, my God. Absolutely.
I also just don't want to hear the answer to any more golf questions. So I thought I'd come on here and start helping you choose them.
Okay, fine. I hand over the reins. What are you going to make me answer today?
Okay, this is one that we get from a lot of listeners. And this question specifically came from someone named Eric. And he wanted to know, what books do you recommend for someone interested in economics, or books that you'd recommend in general?
Morgan, that's exactly the kind of question I would never choose to answer on my own, because I'm just going to say all the books that we've already covered on the show.
No, I'd like to know what else you are reading besides the books of our guests.
So really, I don't read anything else besides the books of our guests, because it takes forever to read all those books. Okay, so I'm going to talk about books I've read in the past.
Okay.
So the first one is a book called Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun. And it was written by Geoffrey Canada. And it's an old book. I must have read it 25 years ago. And it is a very personal account of violence in his life and in the communities around him. And it's just incredibly thoughtful, and it's changed the way I think about crime, which is something that I've thought a lot about. Now, it's not an economics book. It's a sociology book. When it comes to economics, I'm going to go back even further to two books that I read in college. The first one is a book called The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod. And it is this amazing book on game theory. It's actually a book we've talked about on an earlier episode, because Yul Kwan, one of my guests, had used that book as the cornerstone of his strategy in Survivor. It's about how cooperation emerges in the prisoner's dilemma. It inspired me more than anything I had ever read in economics, except for the last book I'm going to mention, which is a book from 1960, and it is by a professor I had at Harvard, Thomas Schelling. He won the Nobel Prize. This book is called Conflict and Strategy, and it is a book of game theory with no math. It's just a really smart guy who thought deeply about the implications of strategic behavior, and I couldn't believe how big and deep the ideas were. It was the thing that pushed me to want to go get a PhD in economics.
Okay, those are great, but those were all written over 25 years ago. Do you think you've read a book in the past 2 decades that you could recommend?
If I had to pick one, I guess I would say Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And the basic idea is so simple and so obvious that I kick myself and I say, how did I never think of that before? And that, to me, is the best advertisement you can make for a book.
Okay, I think I let you off the hook a little bit with this question, especially since I know you're good friends with Richard Thaler. So, of course, you're going to recommend Nudge. But hopefully our listeners will enjoy hearing those recommendations. And I think now we should get back to the interview.
All right, let's do that. As always, we love to get listener emails. The email address is pima, P-I-M-A, @freakonomics.com. Morgan and I both read every email. This has been such a typical Sandel conversation. In 15 minutes, he managed to go from Feynman diagrams to Marcel Proust to the sunk cost fallacy to not liking soy sauce. In the second half, I want to hear more about this new app. Since when do econ professors develop apps? And I also want to hear about his experiences in the Obama administration. I just cannot imagine the chaos that must have ensued when Sandel was put in charge of a government bureaucracy. So earlier in our conversation, you referenced an app that you developed. It's a learning app. What does it do?
It's called Pique, P-I-Q-U-E, like pique your interest. And at its core, it's trying to say, look, we have a fundamental problem in learning new ideas. We read about them, but reading is a bad way of learning. So what it tries to do is it takes books and the ideas in books and says, we're going to turn those into experiences. So like the dollar auction, you're actually going to go and experience something in the app